Good afternoon. That's more like it. Okay, we are going to discuss the riveting topic of sanctions in terms of all of its forms, tools, tactics, and trends. And beside me, I've got Esvia Berger, Julie Guli Zarapova, and Adam Vinkens. And basically, I was going to get each of the panelists quickly to introduce themselves and really talk about what's fascinating them in terms of the technology developments.
Thanks, John. I'm Esvia Berger. I'm a sanctions and defense lawyer with GARD. We're a Norwegian marine insurer, one of the largest in the world. We probably insure around 22,000 vessels of the world fleet. And I focus every day looking at sanctions and probably sanctions evasion and just how far people are prepared to go to make money in difficult jurisdictions. So a lot of this is very much up my alley and what we deal with on a daily basis.
Hello, my name is Guli Zarapova and I currently work at SMBC. It's a Japanese bank in sanctions compliance advisory. Prior to SMBC, I worked at UBS in sanctions advisory as well. So I'm very interested in sanctions and similarly to you. So I'm very interested in sanctions evasion techniques and also technology, AI. So that's why I'm here and thank you so much for having me.
Hi everyone, my name's Adam Wickens. I've got the interesting job title of Head of Crime. Just for full clarity, I am an insurance underwriter, so if you could lock the doors to stop people leaving, that would be great. My role at Realm is a very specialised insurer. We specialise in insuring companies heavily exposed to cryptocurrency. We also insure companies heavily exposed to cannabis, but that's a very different conference. My main role is to underwrite companies that are involved in very heavily sanctioned industries and making sure that those companies are sticking to the rules so I don't have to pay for it, basically. So that's us.
Okay, very interesting. If you look at sanctions, it's one of the fastest moving and most dynamic sectors, mainly because of the ingenuity, if you don't mind me saying, of the people on the other side, the people who are trying to evade the sanctions. But what I'm particularly interested in is data quality challenges and basically also complex corporate structures, because it's no longer just about surveilling dodgy transactions. It's really looking at going to the heart of some of the data, the provenance of the data, and also then very opaque structures, which actually, you would have seen in the securities world. So maybe I might just start with yourself, and do you want to talk about just those specific challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right onto one of the key points, is these complex structures, which are getting increasingly complex. So the greater and the tighter the regulation becomes, the less transparency there is. I mean, just before the war broke out in Russia, you could get just about any Russian corporate documentation information like that publicly, and that all just gradually went away. A lot of that since has been modeled on what Iran has been doing, and quite successfully too. So it's these really, really corporate structures designed purposefully to obfuscate ownership, origin, everything, and it takes place through really, really interesting means. Certificates of origin that are forged using bribed officials in Iraq to show this oil is in fact Iraqi and not Iranian. Falsified cargo documents coming from Russia. And I think the most difficult and most interesting one we've seen recently popped up in Namibia, where a vessel was arrested, was detained, and for an alleged debt against the people they said owned this vessel. And lo and behold, who popped up? A representative of Irisol, of the Iranian International Shipping Line, said, no, these people don't actually own this vessel, we do. And then explained in detail how from 2012, before the sanctions regime started coming in, the structures they put in place to place their entire fleet outside of the ambit of these structures. And effectively saying that everything you see on paper, when someone comes along and says, here's my shareholding certificate, I'm the ultimate beneficial shareholder, can't really be trusted, because in that case, Iran came along and said, shareholder only in name, nominee shareholder actually doesn't mean anything, we control all of this. And what's been really interesting is some of those intermediary companies in that chain mentioned in that case, in that judgment in Namibia, have popped up elsewhere. And when they do, we immediately start asking questions. And I think that kind of feeds into the data quality point too, which is as good as your data is and as clean as the documentation looks, it doesn't necessarily mean it's as squeaky clean as it should be.
And is this an AI-able problem?
I don't think so. I think that's the difficulty, isn't it? Is that AI can't, and even humans can't. You know, if, for example, in a matter relating to this, all the KYC checks would be passed because someone comes up and says, here's everything. Here's my address, here's my passport. I own all of this. And it's only when you start looking deeper. So, for example, in this matter, the ultimate beneficial shareholder, the owner who said she owned all of these companies and ships, was 26 years old, living in downtown Shanghai, in government housing, no history of family money, no history of any involvement in the shipping industry, but suddenly owned 6 or 7 vessels worth $50 million each. You start raising an eyebrow and going, really? So it's that kind of thing where the human element then becomes important. Highly trained humans who can look at the detail, who can look at all of these little things and recognize red flags and just go, it's that little tickle in the back of your head which goes,
I'm an underwriter. I have that every day. To your point, I think that's a really, really good point about the AI part of it. We work with a third-party company who we can't name, but they're in Israel, and one of their roles is to see how we can get around these things. So for around about $150, I can buy myself an online presence, passport, driving license, you name it, no matter what. And the problem you've got with AI is when it scans these documentations, they'll go, hey, this is a passport. Woo-hoo. Everyone moves on with their lives. The problem is, who's checking that passport? Who knows that those numbers aren't just complete gibberish? And I think, from an insurer's perspective, we do look at not just what technology you use, but how you back that up. How do you cleanse that data? Because, you put rubbish in, you get rubbish out. And that's a big challenge for us. So there is really no global one source of truth. There is no way of checking every single passport that exists on this planet. There isn't. And just relying on AI tools, I think, is incredibly dangerous. Because who knows what a Brazilian passport looks as opposed to a British passport? No one really knows. So, to your point, it's data.
I agree, yeah. And from a financial institution's perspective, AI is great, machine learning technology, when it comes, for example, to bulk screening or flagging flagging risks or red flags, bringing them to the sanctions compliance analysts or specialists' attention. And then the human in the loop is very important, because only humans can actually look, at the more nuanced ownership, for example, questions or issues, or more nuanced, only human can make a judgment that AI or machines cannot. So it's very important to also invest into training and the right personnel as well.
I was going to ask you that, Guli, because if you look at, it seems to me the AI can do the perfunctory, the routine checks that can all be automated, but actually the more obscure things, because you're dealing with quite ingenious actors on the other side. How do you train your people so that they're continuously up to the standard that's required?
Exactly, yes. AI should help humans, not replace humans, So,
okay.
Yeah, and training them is very important as well. And also this kind of events, it's very important to attend events, also collaborate with your peers and regulators as well. There are quite a few events, from OFSI, OFAC, EU regulators as well, both online and offline, so it's quite interesting as well. And just sharing your experience, and we had a call prior to this meeting as well, and I felt so good afterwards, that you're not alone,
Yeah,
and people
exactly.
have similar issues, and just exchanging your opinions and expertise, it's just very interesting and useful.
So Adam, I have a question for you. So in the late 90s, and I'm showing my age here, we actually developed the first European bank in Europe in my previous company. And we actually engaged, we thought it was secure, we actually engaged a former firm of hackers where every single person in the company had a criminal conviction for hacking companies. And what we thought was secure could get hacked in like 30 seconds. And just the degree of lateral thinking that these actors have is just incredible. So the problem is, if you're working in an institution where your mindset is good and to do good, you think in those terms, yet you're up against people who think totally differently. So is there a sanctions equivalent of a hacking firm who can actually test out, in other words, get people who have convictions with sanctions fraud, if you like, to actually see how they can break some of your systems? Is there such actors out there?
Don't look at me. I don't do it.
Well,
Everyone turns and looks at
a lot
Adam.
of data. So I would just like to ask the panel this, because we're doing things that we think are very smart, but as people whose orientation is towards abiding by the law, we think in a particular way. And well, put it this way, you know, there have been sanctions on Russia for like 2.5 years, and there's an incredible amount of oil in the world, and nobody knows how it kind of got there.
Yeah, no, I think there are companies out there. I think look, the important thing to remember is with all of these things, you know, when it's criminal behaviour of any type, especially sanctions, right? People are going to, the criminals, sadly, tend to be the smartest guys in the room because they got more time to actually work their way around this. And I think, you know, that there certainly are companies out there that can test it. From my perspective, working in the cryptocurrency space, my job's actually quite easy because wallets will very quickly become flagged as belonging to sanctioned individuals, sanctioned companies, sanctioned countries even. So from my perspective, despite appearances, cryptocurrency is actually one of the most compliant forms of financial exchange on the planet. If you look at financial crime in cryptocurrency, the amount of money being used for illicit funds is 0.01% of all transactions. It's incredibly compliant. And it's flagged really easily. Okay, so that's fine. But when it comes to traditional ones, yeah, you need to do more. You need to get these companies. And I think one of the things that's really, and I want to just share a very quick story about this, is that one of the ways that you need to test the human element is to actually do background checking on those individuals as well. Because at the end of the day, they're going to have the keys to the castle. They're going to be controlling your sanctions and controlling your AML. So you're probably all aware, you may have read in the paper, a company called Coinbase. They may have had a little bit of an accident over the last few days. I can talk about this because it's in the public domain. But these criminals realize that trying to break down the company through pure hacking is impossible, right? It's just not going to work. But what does work is people, and people have bank accounts, and people like money. So if you give the right people the money, they will give you whatever you want. And that's exactly what's happened. And it's then become a social engineering on all of those clients because they were walking away, they got hold of all their details. So I think, you know, when you're talking about testing and testing how robust your compliance and your AML and all of these types of things is, I think the first step is to test the people that are doing it. Really make sure that you've buttoned down, that you've got the right individuals here. And bearing in mind you all work in this, I suddenly realise how unpopular I've become in the room. But, you know, that is one of the key things to consider.
That makes me nervous because I have colleagues sitting in this room and now I'm thinking they're going to go back and make sure I'm checked out. So, but it really is exactly that. It's about making sure you have the right people in the right positions. That's the extreme example. But it feeds back also into the other point, which is training them well. But training can also only go so far if you don't have the right tools and if you don't know what tools to use. And there are so many publicly available databases and things which are great. Open Sanctions is a great one where people can literally just go and search. We all in this room probably use far more things like Acuity and Orbis and all of that. But there are some really interesting databases that people generally aren't aware of. The Kyiv School of Economics worked together with Yale University, and they've created a database based on publicly available information of companies that have divested from Russia and ongoing trade patterns to identify foreign companies that play in the Russian market, which if they pop up on your screens, even though not sanctioned, may need to raise a red flag. So there is a lot of stuff available, but it's coming to these kinds of things, and as Gully was saying, engaging with people, engaging in the right kind of collaborative spirit, that we actually learn what else there is and what's going on.
I just wanted to change direction a little bit. So, Guli, I have a question for you, and it's about geopolitical divergence in terms of some sanctions regulation, and what that really means for firms, where you're asked in a certain jurisdiction to do A, and in Europe you might be asked to do B, and how do you manage those fundamental regulatory conflicts where they're not similar, but they're almost opposing?
Yes, actually just wanted to talk about it as well, because as you said, it's true, like criminals are probably maybe better than us, because they have also, not just because, you know, compliance professionals need to be checked out, but also because we have to work around so many challenges, and divergence is definitely one of the main challenges. So especially for global financial institutions, you know, when you have to comply, not just say with the UN sanctions, but also US sanctions, even if you're not like us, we're a Japanese bank, but, you know, given the weight the US has in the world, so we must comply with the US sanctions as well. And then there are also secondary sanctions risks when it comes to the US sanctions. We must comply with the UK sanctions, being in the UK, and the EU sanctions as well, because there's quite a few touch points, you know, with the EU as well, even after Brexit. So there are, the requirements, they differ as well significantly. Like, for example, when it comes to ownership and controllership, there are different requirements, and also there are quite a few topics, you know, challenges when it comes to this. So as a Japanese bank, for example, we must comply with MOFA, Japanese Ministry of Finance regulations as well. So it is quite challenging. And also, for example, today, as we spoke about it earlier, we are awaiting the EU 17th package as well. And the EU countries even cannot agree between themselves on certain aspects, you know, like... So there are quite a few, difficulties in that respect.
And then kind of related to that, because obviously what a lot of firms try and do is go gold-plated. They try to just go for the highest common denominator, if there is such a thing, and work backwards. But I presume there are some places where that is possible and where that isn't possible.
Yes, exactly. And there's also the internal risk appetite as well. Like sometimes firms, you know, remitters come back to us and ask, okay, but this is actually legal. Why don't you allow, you know, this transaction to, like, as we've discussed earlier as well, to flow, the money, the funds to flow. But then we have our own risk appetite as well, and we must think about our reputation. So we have our risk policies and procedures in place as well. So this is another aspect.
So, and that really brings me on to the next point, which is, I'd like to call it just unpredictability. So there are parts of compliance where it's quite slow moving. All the firms get plenty of time to act, but it looks like within sanctions, you know, things happen in real time and firms have to adapt. So I might just ask you first, how would you manage that?
Nobody has dropped the T word yet, so when it comes to...
Very carefully and very quickly. I think... I'm just replaying a very specific event in my mind and thinking just how much I can share. No, I think it's something that we've also just had to learn on the job, because it's, you know, it all happened so quickly, really. After the war broke out, you constantly had this package after package, which would just change things. And I think especially in the last year or two, for us in our industry, they've been, because these are all geopolitical in nature, there isn't necessarily always logic to them, or even the basis on which someone is sanctioned is sometimes incorrect. And so you have these kind of broadsides being fired. And many people in the industry, certainly in our industry, have been affected by this, and so have we. So we would literally wake up one day, or 5 o'clock odd, usually on a Friday, with suddenly one of our clients being sanctioned, or all vessels or a manager being sanctioned, where we immediately need to act, assess, reassess what's going on. The one I'm thinking about in particular was also one where the regulatory authorities just got it wrong. So an application in due course by them to get delisted was successful. but we had to mobilize an entire team of lawyers, guys from compliance, group legal, to communicate with the authorities, to notify flag states, to get everything in place to make sure that we are adequately protected. But there's always that commercial element to it as well. Depending on who your client is, you also don't want to just leave them in the lurch. So you also have to try to make that kind of judgment call about just how much support can and do we give them without exposing ourselves, and where do we draw the line. So one of my favorite things always to do is, as soon as something pops up vaguely, I call our favorite preferred lawyer and go, hey, can we just have you on retainer so no one else gets you in case something happens, just in case we even find ourselves in conflict with another party.
But maybe just to kind of go further on this, and that sanctions changes happen kind of in real time. And I think the key, I think this is a part of the industry where people just cannot be, there's no such thing as a surprise. Things just drop out of the air all the time. Can you talk about any type of emergency support, or, you know, to kind of rapidly put things in place when there's a change? Have you anything like that in your organization?
Yes, that's me.
Okay.
Well, I say that's me, and we have a team. We have an established team internally, the sanctions team, comprised of lawyers, analysts, everyone. And if one of these things happen, we usually are immediately notified through all of the various databases and things we use, and the analysts usually do that. And we jump and activate, and it really becomes a massive collaborative effort. And I think that's going to be a key word always. It's collaboration, not only within your organization, but with all the parties involved and with the regulatory authorities. And
maybe that a question for you is, how collaborative are the regulators in this space, particularly with last minute changes? Is there much dialogue between because lots of things are implemented, you don't have time to actually analyze even the legislation, so you obviously have to contact regulators, and how does that work, in as much as you can say?
Just before that, to add on the unpredictability of sanctions, and like, for example, we looked a couple of weeks ago, we discussed with the front office the possibility of doing a transaction in oil and gas sector involving Syria, and of course we were very careful about it, and we discussed it with them, and then just a few days ago, we found out, that Trump actually is thinking now about lifting all the sanctions on Syria, and this is very, unpredictable decision. And then again, like going back to the divergence topic, the UK and EU, even though they lifted certain sanctions already with regards to Syria, but there are still like comprehensive, very strict measures in place. So that's going to cause another problem for us, in sanctions space. And when it comes to your questions on the communication with regulators, we actually, it depends.
How long is a piece of string, really?
It depends.
Should we just check? Are there any regulators in here?
That's a good question, actually.
Are there? Don't tell fibs, you're not allowed. Because it does feel like sometimes they are playing Wheel of Sanctions. They'll come in on a Friday and go, today it's Syria. But the trouble we see from an insurance perspective, and this is where we do try to support, you guys who are involved in this, is, they expect you to comply with these sanctions the second that they've rubber stamped it. And it's just generally not practical for companies to be able to react instantaneously, especially if it's something that's happened overnight. Trump's lost the plot again, or Putin's decided that he's going to invade somewhere else. We as an industry, I think, need to almost say to the regulators that you can't really regulate us by fining us for breaches of something that you did at 5 o'clock, and now at 5:01 you're kicking our door down. And I think that's where we were saying about the sharing of data and this collaboration. I think, personally, I'd love to see more collaboration between regulators and industry for greater transparency, so that, if a government is considering something, that they at least give the industry confidentially the ability to act in a timely manner to what they do. And I don't know, maybe I'm, from an underwriter's perspective, I'm a bit removed, but I personally don't see that happening. I don't know if you do.
I think, to some extent, on a very limited basis, some of the regulations have tried to do that. we had these long winding down periods for many things, for oil, for various transactions and securities transactions for a while. But I agree with it would make life so much easier if they could do that for everything. I mean, we were talking the other day about a specific matter as well, where we were in the middle of doing a massive kind of due diligence and payments and transactions with a bank somewhere in the world. The payment was remitted. We'd been in contact with the regulators throughout. The next day, the receiving bank got sanctioned, and the payment got frozen in the US clearing banks and houses, and it took months and months and months for us to release millions of dollars. And we were sitting there going, why didn't you just tell us? We wouldn't have made the payment. And I think comes back to the fact that they're geopolitical in nature. You may be very closely dealing with someone at the regulator on the nuances of something, and someone in a different place, far higher up, with a political twist goes, right, we're doing this now. And I think maybe sometimes what we've gotten the feeling with Adam is it's the left hand not talking to the right within the same organization.
I guess they can't tell us because they don't want individuals and entities who are about to become sanctioned to somehow find out that they are about to get sanctions, and they still manage, like I worked at UBS, it's a large wealth manager as well. We have a very big private banking division as well, and somehow, Russian oligarchs, sanctioned individuals found out before they got sanctioned, and that they are about to get sanctioned, and started, moving funds and ownership, and afterwards we investigated quite a few cases like this, and still managed to, report them to the regulators, even though at the time they did it, it was legal, but we suspected, that they've somehow found out.
So they had better data than the firms. Okay, but just to ask you a kind of a related question, I'm really interested in enforcement and big fines that I see, and particularly from OFAC. If you look at them, they, when they decide they're actually going to fine a firm for sanctions, they actually do it in style, and you're talking about 10-digit numbers sometimes in terms of the enforcement actions. But what's really interesting is the root cause, or if you look at what the regulator goes after in sanctions, is lack of controls. Now the issue that I see with that is a control takes a long time to put in place. You have systems to put in, you have people to train, and all of those things. So it looks to me like while the regulations may change and what you're sanctioning may change, the controls that you're putting in place, have to be there for a period of time. So a question is, how do you construct controls, or is anybody here interested in just making sure that they're fit for purpose? Is that too boring a question to ask?
No, I think it's a process of trial and error, really. We were talking about this earlier as well, especially with, I think this all started, we took a shot in the dark and we tried to peg it somewhere. And then, for example, you'd get the kind of situation where you have 1 million false positives and you're spending lots of time and money just trying to weed out the things that actually aren't an issue but were first raised as red flags. So then you try to move the threshold, and then you go too low, and then suddenly there's a risk issue. So it's very much an iterative process, and it's trying, I think, then to find that balance between the experienced human element with technology and AI to make, I suppose, the right decision which matches your commercial risk appetite. And that's not easy, I think. And I think I pity the underwriters in our organization sometimes as well, because I can give them the advice on what the potential sanctions risk might be, but they need to make that call.
So Adam, how's your risk appetite there?
Oh, none whatsoever. Depends who's asking. If my boss is here, then none at all. No, I think, when we look at companies, nobody's perfect, right? You can go from the very big banks in this world right down to one-man bands that are all affected by these issues, and no one's going to have, the answer to every single question. I think when we underwrite companies, and the advice that we would give is it's do the best you can, which I know sounds like a really throwaway, pointless answer, but it is absolutely true. Invest in the right technology, have the right partners, really do the research, have the right people there. I mean, that's really what we look for when we're underwriting these companies, because, like I said, there is no golden bullet to this. And it's about having those robust controls. But I think the other bit that we look at, and we would always say, is it's brilliant having those robust controls, but it's also how do you make sure that those are being followed, right? You can all write down an amazing rule book, but if no one follows it, then it's not worth the paper it's printed on, right? So really having that control around the compliance functions and so forth, that's one of the key things that we'll look for.
Okay, so I'm going to ask one more question, but before I do, we're going to start questions from the audience in just 3 or 4 minutes. So if people have questions, if they can just put them on the app, and then we'll deal with them in a second. But before we get to that, really the last point or question is the cost is going up and up here, and that firms have enormous investments to make on the technology side, on the human resource side, and basically higher and higher quality people are needed all the time for this. So really starting with you, Adam, because you also talked about risk appetite, but just in terms of cost-benefit analysis, I think we're at a point where the cost of sanctions, monitoring, surveillance, etc., is enormous. And how do firms equate that in terms of the risk? And are we getting to a point that for some business lines, the risk just exceeds the benefit?
Sadly, yes, probably. I think, if you look at, where we are in the, the financial cycle of the world at the moment, you are seeing margins pushed. Sadly, compliance is one of those areas where people go, yeah, we can save a bit of money there. We don't need this guy really, we know what we're doing. And I think, this is where businesses really do need to take a step back and really look at, what is that potential massive fine as opposed to how much we invest in this. And I think this is where, something like this are really, really great. You're seeing a lot of companies out there that, maybe you can look at outsourcing something that you've done internally. It might be more attractive financially. So I think we're starting to get to a point where people are overlooking the dangers of the massive fines to save a penny here and there. I don't, as an underwriter, I think that's not a great idea, but I'm bound to say that. But I think it's sad but true. I think that's where we are.
Okay, just quickly, anybody else, and then we'll take some questions.
Everyone agreed with an underwriter.
Okay.
Can I get recording of that?
Okay, I think we might take some questions, if there are any. Sure? I think there's a mic on its way.
Hi, thank you very much, and I really like the concrete example. I would like, my question is about the quantification of the risk, because we are looking at the non-financial risk. And I've been speaking to many CROs or, head of audit committee, and what they explain to me, they say, it's so difficult to understand what is a non-financial risk, back to your point about the huge amount of fine. And my second question is, it's not only the fine, but it's also all the implication, because if you get caught, you have a fine, how much money you will have to spend to, if you have an ombudsman, for 3 years, that, will be maybe 3 times the cost of the fine. So I'd love to have your perspective, quantification, and how do you then have this conversation with your organization and the board? Thank you.
It's an interesting question. I can't remember who the politician was who said, but you fix the roof while the sun is shining. Because if you put off what they perceive as a non-financial risk, the moment it hits the, that fine comes through, suddenly it's a very financial risk. And I think from that perspective, it's very important that boards of companies are made aware of just what the implications are. And to your point, it's not just the fine, it's then the cost of correcting that. The fact that the regulators are going to be watching you because you've been bad, and things like that. So I think it's very important that these things are probably addressed before you get to that point. It is difficult, but I think maybe, waiving some of the news articles about what people have been, fined for, and it doesn't, necessarily affect companies, that they don't think they're exposed to it. But the truth is, everyone's exposed to this.
It's also important to consider the nature, you know, the dynamic nature of the geopolitical changes, and it's very difficult, as we just discussed, to predict, you know, what's going to happen next. That's why even if today something is legal and we can proceed, you know, from UN, US, UK, EU perspective, like tomorrow things can change. So it's so important to look at the reputational aspect as well, like being involved with like certain entities, individuals, or in certain sectors as well that are more risky.
So I'm the moderator, but I'd also like to answer the question because it's part of our core business in Corlytics. I'll give you a couple of examples. Risk is probability multiplied by impact. So the probability of some of these things happening may be relatively low, but the impact when they happen is enormous. So give you some practical examples. The large US bank got fined about 18 months ago for inadequate controls. The fine was $400 million. The remediation program was $2 billion. The second thing about a fine, and if you look at legal risk, it's not like any other type of non-financial risk. So if you have a trading loss, you have a trading loss, and that's fine. And the next time you have a trading loss, you have a trading loss because it's a probability game. With a legal risk, there's a little bit like, if I drive a high-powered car, I have a probability of getting caught speeding. But if I get caught speeding twice and I get caught a third time, the consequences are a whole lot less. So in legal risk, the consequences are cumulative. So it's not just reputational damage. Another example is there was a French bank fined $8 billion for a sanctions evasion. They thought it would be $1 billion, which they put in their accounts. And basically they were barred for a year for dollar clearing. So if you get a sanctions violation as a bank is an indictable offense. In other words, a bank actually commits a crime. That means technically in the US, that bank can lose its banking license in any state. So the consequences for sanctions violation is not even financial. It goes beyond that. Because in a bank or an insurance company, you're regulated. If the regulator takes your license away, you're out of business. So that's how serious it is. So given that, we have about 3 minutes left. So I was going to get each of you to give the audience here one last minute, starting with yourself, Adam, in a minute.
Right. I've never done anything for a minute. I talk for hours. I mean, my one takeaway from this, well, hopefully that you'll remember, other than the wheel of sanctions, which, by the way, I think is real, is going back to a very early point we talked about, which is the data part of this. And I'll give you one very quick, because I'm watching the time. So we utilize a tool that monitors sanctioned wallets on blockchains. And 99% of the time, it is fantastically, it works. The one time it didn't was where this company, which will remain anonymous, they actually flagged 3 wallets as being, I think they put them down as a terrorist organization. The sad fact was that this terrorist organization was actually the government of Belgium, who didn't take very well to being sanctioned. They got very upset. So there was a lot of money that came from that lawsuit. The takeaway is data. It's don't necessarily always trust it. Always check it.
Okay, another data point. It's on to you now.
Yeah, I agree. Like we discussed the costs as well. There are direct costs, but there are also indirect costs, you know, caused by operational inefficiency and customer frictions, complaints, lost opportunities as well. So that's why I agree the data is very important, technology, machine learning, you know, and AI, but also investing into human element and into training and collaboration between departments as well, and cross-divisional, cross-jurisdictional collaboration as well in large financial institutions. And there is quite a lot of there's quite a lot of pressure, not just on large financial institutions, but also smaller financial institutions now. They're under a lot of pressure as well. So it's very important to stay up to date and attend this kind of events, share your experiences.
Excellent. Esfia, 1 minute.
I think sanctions evasion techniques and tactics have become so advanced now that it's no longer sufficient to do the tick box exercise. It's no longer good enough to just have your little list of controls go, yeah, we did all that and everything's fine. They're ahead of us, they're ahead of enforcement, they're ahead of everyone constantly, which is, I suppose, why I have a job. But I think it's like my grandfather always used to say, if it smells fishy, it's probably a dead fish, because healthy fish don't smell. And it's that little tickle, and I think it's that. And it's about having the right people in the right positions to just have that feeling, to trust your gut when something smells fishy, to dig deeper. I think that's what's expected of us, as costly as it may be.
Okay, so a big thank you to our panel. And a big thank you to you all as well for managing to stay awake. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Okay.